What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my DFS picks for NFL Week 4. Final look.
These picks apply for DraftKings and FanDuel. Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon.
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to go over my top picks for this week's NFL slate. And if you stick around to the very end of this video, we'll use the Draft Dashboard tools to make a DFS lineup using the picks we just made. Okay guys, NFL Week 4. Let's take a look at the quarterback position. So, of course, one of the top picks of the week, of the season so far this season, at the quarterback position is Josh Allen from the Buffalo Bills, playing the Baltimore Ravens, who have the absolute worst defense overall. They give up the second most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Josh Allen has averaged 32.3 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.3 rush attempts per game. He's going to be about 14% owned, projected at 26.3 fantasy points here in Week 4. He's $8,400 DraftKings salary, $500 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 51 points scored in this game, with the Buffalo Bills favored by 3. So Josh Allen has scored 31, 33, and 34 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 8, 1, and 10 rush attempts. So he's got a fantastic matchup in a high-scoring game. So I like Josh Allen here versus the Baltimore Ravens. Now the other stud that I like is Jalen Hurts from the Philadelphia Eagles, playing the Jacksonville Jaguars, who have had a pretty good defense overall. They're middle of the pack defending opposing quarterbacks. Jalen Hurts has averaged 30.8 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 12.3 rush attempts per game. He's going to be about 10% owned, projected at 24.9 fantasy points here in Week 4. He's $8,200 DraftKings salary, $400 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 45.5 points scored in this game, with the Eagles favored by 6.5. So Jalen Hurts has scored 31, 37, and 25 fantasy points in the last 3 games. And I like this pick because he got 9, 11, and 17 rush attempts in those games. So he has monster rushing upside. So I like Jalen Hurts here versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. Now I actually like Russell Wilson this week. He's got a nice matchup here versus the Raiders. Only going to be about 2% owned. And he's $6,700 DraftKings salary, $400 more on FanDuel. The Raiders give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. So I like Russell Wilson here versus the Las Vegas Raiders. Now I also like Marcus Mariota, Super Mario from the Atlanta Falcons, playing the Cleveland Browns, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. They give up the 9th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Marcus Mariota has averaged 18.3 fantasy points per game on the season, and he's getting an average of 8.3 rush attempts per game. So he's got a pretty big rushing upside, only going to be about 9% owned, and he's projected at 18.3 fantasy points here in Week 4. Now, I like this pick because he's only $5,600 DraftKings salary and $1,700 more on FanDuel. So I love that DraftKings price. Vegas thinks there's going to be 47.5 points scored in this game, with the Falcons trailing by 1. So Marcus Mariota has scored 18, 16, and 21 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 7, 6, and 12 rush attempts. So I like his price tag. He's got a good matchup and a ton of rushing upside. So I like Marcus Mariota here versus the Cleveland Browns. Now I also like Jacoby Brissett and Cooper Rush, but let's take a look at the running back position. So stud on the slate that I like is Saquon Barkley from the New York Giants playing the Chicago Bears, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. They give up the 7th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Saquon Barkley has averaged 23.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5 pass targets per game and 17.7 rush attempts per game. So that's a ton of volume. He's on the field for 86% of the snaps, gonna be about 20% owned, projected at 20.3 fantasy points here in week 4. He's 8,000 DraftKings salary, 100 more on FanDuel, and Vegas thinks there's going to be 39.5 points scored in this game, with the Giants favored by 2.5. So Saquon Barkley has scored 23, 12, and 36 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 14, 21, and 18 rush attempts on top of 4, 4, and 7 pass targets. So I like that he's getting a ton of volume, I like the matchup, and I like that his price tag is still relatively low for his upside. So I like Saquon Barkley here versus the Chicago Bears. Now I also like Nick Chubb. He's got a little bit more of a difficult matchup here versus the Falcons, who have been pretty good versus opposing running backs. But Nick Chubb has averaged 23.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 20.7 rush attempts per game and 1.7 pass target per game. Now, he is only on the field for 56% of the snaps, but he's getting over 20 touches per game, so I don't think that stat matters here. And he's only going to be about 5% owned, projected at 17 fantasy points. And he's 7,900 DraftKings salary, 1,300 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 47.5 points scored in this game, with the Browns favored by 1. So Nick Chubb has scored 20, 32, and 18 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 23, 17, and 22 rush attempts on top of 1, 3, and 1 pass target. So he's not really involved in the passing game, but he's getting enough rushing attempts to give him that monster rushing upside. So I like Nick Chubb here versus the Atlanta Falcons. Now I also like Najee Harris from the Pittsburgh Steelers playing the New York Jets, who have the 9th worst defense overall. They give up the 9th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Najee Harris has averaged 12.9 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 13.3 rush attempts per game and 3.7 pass targets per game. He's been on the field for 70% of the snaps, going to be about 10% owned, projected at 16.1 fantasy points here in week 4. And I like this pick because he's only 6,700 DraftKings salary, 300 more on FanDuel, and Najee Harris has scored 14, 14, and 11 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 15, 15, and 10 rush attempts on top of 3, 6, and 2 pass targets. So he's gotten between 18 and 21 touches the past 2 weeks. Pretty good volume and a fantastic matchup. So I like Najee Harris here versus the New York Jets. Okay, everyone, it's time to announce the winner of our $25 weekly PayPal giveaway. And the winner is Cameron Cotter. Congratulations, Cameron Cotter. You are the winner of this week's $25 PayPal giveaway. Please reply to our comment to collect your prize.
Before I continue with the picks, I'm excited today because we added a new contest for everyone watching.
If you want to enter the drawing for $25 PayPal,
all you need to do is like this video, hit that subscribe button, and make a quick comment below to be entered into the drawing. We'll reply to a random comment and let you know that you won.
And we'll send you $25 PayPal.
So it's that easy, and we pick a new winner every Saturday and announce them in our video. So get your comment in now so I can add another entry for you.
Now, I also like Jamal Williams, who's only $6,100 DraftKings salary, $1,300 more on FanDuel. He got 20 rush attempts last game and 2 pass targets, scored 25 fantasy points. He's going to be about 23% owned, projected at 14.9 fantasy points here in week 4. He's only $6,100 DraftKings salary, $1,300 more on FanDuel. So he's got a good matchup and he's got some pretty good upside for a low salary. So I like Jamal Williams here versus the Seattle Seahawks. Now, as a sleeper pick, I'm going to include him in tomorrow's video as well, but I like Khalil Herbert from the Chicago Bears playing the New York Giants, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. They give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing running backs, so he's got a good matchup, and he came in for the injured David Montgomery last game. He got 20 rush attempts and 2 pass targets, scored 34 fantasy points, only going to be about 2% owned, so I think he's going under the radar here, and he's projected at 15.4 fantasy points, and he's only $5,700 DraftKings salary, $1,500 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 39.5 points scored in this game, with the Chicago Bears trailing by 2.5. So not a super high scoring game here, but a good matchup, a low price tag, and if he gets anywhere close to the touches that he did last week, he should be a pretty good value play here and sleeper pick. So I like Khalil Herbert here versus the New York Giants. Okay, let's take a look at the wide receiver position. So some studs on the slate that I like: Stephon Diggs in a phenomenal spot here versus the Baltimore Ravens, who have the worst defense overall. They give up the absolute most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Stephon Diggs averaging 30.5 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 11.7 pass targets per game. Gonna be about 21% owned. Now, he's expensive at $8,400 DraftKings salary, $300 more on FanDuel. But I like Stephon Diggs here versus the Baltimore Ravens. I also like A.J. Brown. I like Michael Pittman Jr. But another guy that I like is CeeDee Lamb from the Dallas Cowboys playing the Washington Commanders, who have the 2nd worst defense overall. They give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. CeeDee Lamb has averaged 14.2 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 11.3 pass targets per game. I like this pick because he's been on the field for 96% of the snaps, gonna be about 15% owned, projected at 15.8 fantasy points here in week 4, and he's still only $6,700 DraftKings salary, $100 more on FanDuel. Now remember, he has Cooper Rush throwing him the ball, but he put up 23 fantasy points off of 12 pass targets with Cooper Rush, so I see no problem there, and he's got a fantastic matchup. Vegas thinks there's going to be 41.5 points scored in this game, with the Dallas Cowboys favored by 3.5. So I like CeeDee Lamb here versus the Washington Commanders. Now I also like Courtland Sutton from the Denver Broncos playing the Las Vegas Raiders. He's averaged 17.2 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 9.3 pass targets per game. He's been on the field for 91% of the snaps, going to be about 8% owned, projected at 15 fantasy points here in week 4. He's $6,400 DraftKings salary, $400 more on FanDuel. So I like Courtland Sutton here versus the Las Vegas Raiders. But I also like Amari Cooper from the Cleveland Browns playing the Atlanta Falcons, who have the 5th worst defense overall. They give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Amari Cooper has averaged 19.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 9 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 82% of the snaps, gonna be about 13% owned, projected at 15 fantasy points here in week 4. He's 6,300 DraftKings salary, 1,200 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 47.5 points scored in this game, with the Browns favored by 1. So Amari Cooper has scored 26, 28, and 5 fantasy points in the last 3 games, off of 11, 10, and 6 pass targets. He's got a fantastic matchup, so I like Amari Cooper here versus the Atlanta Falcons. Now, some other notable mentions or honorable mentions. Deontay Johnson from the Pittsburgh Steelers playing the New York Jets, getting an average of 11 pass targets per game for only 6,000 DraftKings salary, 1,000 more on FanDuel, on the field for 88% of the snaps, gonna be about 19% owned. The Jets have the 9th worst defense overall, give up the 6th most fantasy points to opposing, the 8th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. So he's got a great matchup. So I like Deontay Johnson here versus the New York Jets. I also like Tyler Lockett from the Seattle Seahawks. Has a good matchup here versus the Detroit Lions, who have the 2nd worst defense overall, give up the 6th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. And Tyler Lockett has averaged 15 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 8.7 pass targets per game, on the field for 84% of the snaps, gonna be about 18% owned. So I like Tyler Lockett. Oh, he's 5,900 DraftKings salary, 1,000 more on FanDuel. Great matchup here, so I like Tyler Lockett here versus the Detroit Lions. And I'll give you one more player that I like, wide receiver. I like Greg Dortch from the Arizona Cardinals playing the Carolina Panthers, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. They're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing wide receivers. And Greg Dortch has averaged 15.3 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 7.7 pass targets per game. And he's on the field for 80% of the snaps, gonna be about 3% owned, projected at 10.9 fantasy points here in week 4. He's 5,000 DraftKings salary, 300 more on FanDuel. So he's gonna be low owned. He's got a low price tag, averaging 7.7 pass targets per game and 15.3 fantasy points per game. So I like Greg Dortch here versus the Carolina Panthers. Now I also like Noah Brown. I'll talk about him more tomorrow in my sleeper picks video.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all the tools for NFL. NBA is right around the corner. This is a great time to get in and try everything for 1 month. The tools are all about saving research time. You can see the last 3 games, the fantasy points per game, the targets they got per game, so you can see how involved they are in the offense, the rushes they got per game. Seeing all this stuff on one screen helps you save time and make better picks. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
So let's move on to the tight end position. So I like Darren Waller here, guys. I just think he's underpriced and underowned. He's from the Las Vegas Raiders, playing the Denver Broncos, who have a good defense overall, but they give up the 8th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends.
Darren Waller has averaged 11.4 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.3 pass targets per game. He's been on the field for 70% of the snaps, gonna be about 3% owned, projected at 13.4 fantasy points here in week 4. He's 5,600 DraftKings salary, 900 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 45.5 points scored in this game, with the Raiders favored by 2.5. So Darren Waller has scored 5, 17, and 12 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 5, 8, and 6 pass targets. I just think he's got 20 plus fantasy point upside any given game. Although he hasn't flashed it yet, that game is coming. He's got a good matchup here this week. So I like Darren Waller here versus the Denver Broncos. I also like Zach Ertz from the Arizona Cardinals playing the Carolina Panthers, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. They're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing tight ends. Zach Ertz has averaged 12.5 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 8.3 pass targets per game. He's been on the field for 80% of the snaps, gonna be about 4% owned, projected at 11.7 fantasy points here in week 4. He's 4,700 DraftKings salary, 800 more on FanDuel, and Zach Ertz has scored 11, 16, and 11 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 10, 11, and 4 pass targets. So I like Zach Ertz here versus the Carolina Panthers. Now I also like TJ Hawkinson from the Detroit Lions playing the Seattle Seahawks, who have the 10th worst defense overall, give up the 7th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. TJ Hawkinson has averaged 8.1 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6 pass targets per game. He's been on the field for 85% of the snaps, gonna be about 9% owned, projected at 11.4 fantasy points here in week 4. He's 4,100 DraftKings salary, 1,300 more on FanDuel. So he's got a good matchup. Vegas thinks there's gonna be 48 points scored in this game, with the Lions favored by 3.5. So I like TJ Hawkinson here versus the Seattle Seahawks. Now coming down in salary here, I also like David Njoku from the Cleveland Browns playing the Atlanta Falcons, who have the 5th worst defense overall. They give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. David Njoku averaging 10.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5.3 pass targets per game. Although most of those points and targets came last game when he scored 24 fantasy points off of 10 pass targets, but he's been on the field for 90% of the snaps, gonna be about 9% owned, projected at 9.4 fantasy points here in week 4. So David Njoku only 3,700 DraftKings salary. He's 2,000 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 47.5 points scored in this game, and they have the Cleveland Browns favored by 1. So I like this play. I think it's going to be kind of a hit or miss play. High risk, high reward, but he's got a fantastic matchup. And we see he's got that 24 plus fantasy point upside, got a ton of pass targets last game. So I like David Njoku here versus the Atlanta Falcons. Now I'm going to talk about this guy tomorrow in my sleeper picks video, but I also like Tyler Conklin from the New York Jets. He's only 3,600 DraftKings salary. He's 1,800 more on FanDuel playing the Pittsburgh Steelers. He has a middle-of-the-pack matchup here, but he's averaged 12.7 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 8 pass targets per game. On the field for 90% of the snaps, only going to be about 4% owned, scored 16, 10, and 11 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 8, 9, and 7 pass targets. So I like Tyler Conklin here versus the Pittsburgh Steelers. If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smiggity smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NFL slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again and good luck.